2008. I'm Council Member Roger Horton, Chair of the committee. With me are Council Member Falcone and Council Member Schneider. Our item for discussion today is the Police Department Locker Room Upgrade Project and some funding options for that. Mr. Pearson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director, and I'm actually going to turn this right over to John Schoaf, who will make the presentation.
Okay, Mr. Schoaf, proceed.
Chairman and committee members, today I'm going to be asking you to make some tough decisions concerning both the scope and the funding options for the upgrade for the locker at the police department. The purpose of today's report is to update the Finance Committee on the design of the PD locker room, report some findings of our first phase or our analysis of the HVAC system and the electrical analysis. Want to receive direction or discuss at least the project scope and let you choose an option of which project scope you'd like to go with, and then discuss project funding. Let's go. By way of background, the existing locker rooms are from a converted utility room in the basement. It was never designed to be a locker room, for that matter, or occupied for that matter. It had low-hanging utility ducts, pipes. There's no ventilation. It's not ADA compliant. It's very tired, very deteriorated, and just dilapidated facilities. I want to thank the council members that had time to go to the tour yesterday. This is a picture of the old lockers and the locker room that's in there. You can see the low-hanging utilities, the old lockers which are not energized, and just the state of the locker room itself.
Mr. Schoaf, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Could you explain why the lockers should be energized? People are not going to understand that from why they have a bunny.
Right. The police department has moved into the modern age and uses cell phones, tasers, rechargeable flashlights. All these things run off of power, and all these things need some place to be plugged in to be recharged. The proposed lockers would be actually have outlets in them to allow officers to recharge their equipment that they use every day. So that's the purpose of having power to these to the locker room. You can see the low-hanging ducts. You can imagine some of our taller officers, and this gentleman is not extremely tall by any means, but some of our taller officers having difficulty getting in there and getting to their facilities. On October 30th, 2007, the council entered into a design services contract with Paul Poirier and Michael David Architect. The design services contract was split up into two phases plus a decision point in the middle of those two phases. We have completed that first phase. That first phase included an assessment and a feasibility study of the HVAC system and the electrical systems, an estimate and some scope. Quite frankly, staff was very concerned about the existing HVAC system, if it could handle any more load on it, or conversely, if we decided to put in a new system to just handle the locker room, if it could handle that, because by taking that away from the existing system, it would literally freeze it out, and the HVAC system would shut down at that point. The decision point which we're at now, and then phase two is a final design, final estimate, and construction phasing. Right now, some of the results of the test, the HVAC system. The main system is a chiller boiler configuration. That means that we heat the air and we cool the air, and then we mix it together to try and get the right temperature. You can see how inefficient that would be. It's oversized, it's very old, it's in poor condition, and it's inefficient. Over the years, there's been 10 different systems added to serve that main building. That means there's 10 different operating systems for different parts of the building. That compromises the reliability of that main system by, like I was saying, if you take it away, it ends up getting too cold. It starts getting too cold, it starts to freeze up. Well, the good news is that we could use the existing system. with the new proposed improvements and proposed locker room, we would sort of, and as the report said, limp along with slightly better circulation. Like staff was worried about, we could not add an additional unit that would freeze up that main unit, and we'd be in trouble in that respect. The electrical, the main switchboard, transformer, and distribution panels are obsolete. They're old. The replacement parts are unavailable. Age and impedance has created inefficiencies, and there's no backup power. That means if we have an incident and officers need to get their equipment out, it's completely black in the locker room, and they can't function at that point. There's three basic options. The good news in this project is that we can do a little bit and do a little bit more and do a little bit more, and we can actually phase it over time if we wanted to. It's not a project where we have to do the whole thing or we'll be having to reconstruct items. So the first option that we have is just the locker room and the exercise rooms upgrade. That would be a complete new lockers, pipes would go underground, ADA compliant restrooms, would not touch the emergency generators or the serious electrical deficiencies, nor would it provide HVAC system, a new HVAC system. And the cost of that is $1.5 million. Mechanical and electric room analysis we've already done, and the design we've already allotted for and allocated that money. Construction cost at 1.1. Construction management and inspection at $100,000. And then relocation during construction at another $100,000, and we've got an allowance of $10,000 for city permits. The second option, or option B, would be a locker room, exercise room upgrade, plus the electrical improvements and a new generator. Actually, two new generators, both diesel, to power the building. And that would be at an additional roughly $200,000. So we're at about $1.8 million for the entire project. Again, we're at 1.7 for the construction management, 100 for the relocation, and city permits stay the same at 10,000. The construction basically goes up on that project. Oh, I'm sorry. And then option C is everything. It's the locker room, exercise room upgrade, electrical improvements, new generator, and a new HVAC system that would power the entire building, or would furnish the entire building, service the entire building. That project is at $5.2 million. We would see a savings of about $30,000 per year for energy. That's a 40% reduction in energy together with that, and our carbon footprint would be reduced by...
John, is that a heat pump system?
The new one?
Yes.
Yes, it is similar to a heat
And
pump
where would
system.
that be installed?
It would be on the roof, and one in the basement. There's already an area for that.
Okay, judging from what happened at the courthouse, that's an extensive excavation, correct?
No, I don't think it would be that difficult of a
Aren't you
system.
talking 20, 30 feet down?
No, we're not doing a geo system like they have at the courthouse at all. This is a unit that stays above. We're not using the thermal, the earth to heat or cool this. The project ends up at about $5.2 million to redo the entire building and to go forward with it. A little bit about project funding, and I'm going to turn it over to Dave and Bob real quickly just to briefly discuss some impacts. The project is not currently funded except for the design of the project. We need $1.3 million for a total project cost, and that's to do option A. That's the cheapest of the options to do that. Really, your choices are two: the general fund reserves or you're an RDA. And the RDA could be made very easy, even though it's not within the project area, it could be made very easy. Nexus, because it serves the area and it's a very legitimate thing to do.
Ms. Schneider.
Thank you. First off, for the record, even though I couldn't make the site visit yesterday, I did get a tour this morning with Lieutenant Kresge, so that, just so you know, so I felt very tall, which is saying a lot since I'm 5'3". One question, though, before you get to the funding, the women's locker room, which is up a story, it's up on the next flight up, I don't think they have the same kind of electrical outlets that we are talking about in terms of upgrading the men's locker room, and I didn't see that in here. So I know they don't need the same kind of structural improvements as the men's locker room, but the area, because last time I was in there, everyone around the sink was plugging in their, radios and cell phones and everything else around the sink area and so forth. So is that in this project at all, or is there plans for that, or is that just not something we're talking about today?
Councilmember Schneider, it's not in these plans, and it's not something that
So we're just talking about because it's
discussing
just below the area and doing that,
right.
the men's
We haven't
locker
looked
rooms,
at-
basically.
We haven't looked at the women's locker room.
At the women's
at
locker
all.
room. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Pearson, Mr. Bossy, Mr. Gustafson.
I could begin, Dave Gustafson.
Okay, Dave.
Assistant Community Development Director. We don't have a presentation for you on funding. One of the things you're contemplating is redevelopment agency funding. And as you can tell from the staff report, although it's not, the facility's not in the project area, it serves the project area, so it is a eligible use of redevelopment funds. And I've noticed the conversation that's been going on since the agenda report came out regarding priorities for redevelopment agency funding. So we could pretty much answer questions for you if you had questions about other redevelopment projects, the surpluses that we have, affordable housing projects, that sort of thing. I think I would turn it over to Brian first to kind of walk you through, if you would like, what we have in the way of capital funding and what we anticipate coming up and what those priority projects are.
Well, the questions that I raised with Mr. Pearson yesterday when I spoke with him was I wanted to know what the current list was. Since this is not on the list, would this be displacing something that was on the list, and what would that be? Or would we be expanding the list? And those are the kind of questions.
That's the cue that I think Brian can respond to
Okay.
on the capital projects.
Brian?
Good afternoon. Let's see, where should I start? I guess the first place to start is with our existing funding resources. Currently, we have the agency board in the past years has been wise enough to set aside a set amount of money for contingency. It's our contingency account, which we use to fund shortfalls in existing projects. As you said, Mr. Horton, this is not an existing project, so it's not found anywhere on our capital project list. Right now, that particular account has approximately $2.3 million in it. Most recently, it was used, $2 million was taken out of that to help fund the Creo Recreation Center. So that's the first, I guess, funding source, if you will. Other identified sources of funding include fiscal year 2009's tax increment revenue, which we anticipated we're estimated about $4.7 million. So that would be coming up. And one additional source of funding that could be made available are the interest earnings from our 2001 and 2003 bond funds, which a conservative estimate on those, which we also have tapped into recently, but a conservative estimate on those is about $1 million. So those are three different funding sources for you to consider. What impact would that have? Again, as Mr. Horton stated, this is not on our current capital project list. Before I get there, one thing I should also mention is that the money that comes from our tax increment, not knowing what the impact of the state budget crisis are going to have on the redevelopment agency, and the very strong likelihood that we think a possible ERAF measure could come down and take a portion of that money. That's one thing we're a bit concerned about, and we probably won't know anything until the late summer, early fall at the earliest. And as we have mentioned to you in the past, once that situation is kind of cleaned itself up, not the state budget, but just what impact it's going to have on us this year, we could come back to you as we have in past years and pursue opportunities for either community grants or additional new capital projects. So in a sense of what would this, if you were to take some of this money, it would impact possible future projects or community grants, as well as some of your other existing capital projects that may need funding in the future. And if you want, I can just touch on a couple of those if you want me to. Most immediately, we would have the Community Arts Workshop, which is scheduled to go in across the street here. So that would be coming up more late summer. We anticipate approximately the need for about between $650,000 to $750,000 to fund that project in its entirety. Other projects that do not have a set dollar amount yet, but we know that they're coming somewhere down the line, include our Transit Village project at Carrillo and Chapala, as well as the Mission Creek Flood Control Project, possible opportunities to increase funding there, as well as Plaza de la Guerra, which we're currently in the very initial design stages of. So those are a few of the projects that will likely need money, and there's a number of others, but those are your beefier projects, if you will.
Mr. Pearson, over to you. Ms. Falcone, did you have a question at this point?
No, I have a series of comments and questions, so I'll wait.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I just thought I'd mention that since John had mentioned in the slide, noted that the other option besides the RDA is the city's general fund unappropriated reserves, that I know you're all well aware of the fact that we still do have substantial general fund reserves, over $20 million. However, as you also know, that number does already fall short of what our policy would call for. And so while I like to accentuate the positive and note that we have over $20 million in reserves, which is a substantial amount of money, that would be a decision that the committee and ultimately the council would have to make as to whether on balance it is better to use the general fund reserves or the RDA money, understanding that there are trade-offs either way. So it's really all I can say about the general fund reserves, which you already knew.
Okay. Is it over to the committee then? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Falcone, your light's on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. So just to be very crystal clear about the general fund unappropriated reserves, we have a policy that says that 15% of whatever our general fund budget shall be kept in reserve, and then beyond that we have 10% for emergency reserves. So it's a cumulative amount of 25%. And as the general fund goes up, and in the time that I've been here, it has fluctuated anywhere from $194 million to about $206 million, give or take the kind of year we're having. So that reserve then 25% of that general fund money, let's call it $200 million for just round numbers, it fluctuates given the type of year we're having. Is that a correct or fair statement?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Falcone, that is, I think, though, that point out that, as you know, that the general fund budget is about $107 or $8 million at this point. The $200 million is citywide operating budget.
Sorry, that's true.
But you're correct in that the vast majority of the other funds.
But the reserve funds that are kept in the enterprise zone is reserve funds for the waterfront or the airport, or they're in pockets, but it still fluctuates on that same curve.
That's absolutely right. And as the budget goes up, so does the reserve requirements pursuant to the policy.
Right.
Maybe not as fast as our reserves are going up, and therein lies part of the problem in terms of the gap between the two.
Right. So we can overfund the reserves in one year just to have the economy tank, and then we're surplus in the reserves, if you will.
I think that's true. Hypothetically, I think the gap between the two at this point is large enough that that we wouldn't see that happen.
But just as a hypothetical,
absolutely.
Could happen. I'm just trying to give people an idea of how this money sort of, bobs and weaves, if you will.
That's true.
Although we shouldn't take advantage of it. So thank you for that. Not having been part of whatever conversation you're referring to, Mr. Gustafson, I have no idea, and I'm glad I'm not, because I don't want to file any Brown Acts here. But it seems to me that over the last, number of years, there are those of us who have been arguing all along that RDA is part of the ability of the RDA to fund enhancements to the police building exist because you have certain criteria in the RDA mechanism that says if it's for a public use that really benefits the public at large, then you can use RDA monies for that. Now, I've been arguing that all these many years, and I'm glad that it's now become a well-established opportunity. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Chair and Member Falcone. Just to put a fine spin on what you said, it's entirely correct, although it's not that it would necessarily benefit the general public, but it would benefit the folks in the project area.
Well,
obviously, the police headquarters indeed does that, so there's no question as to its eligibility.
And the public at large,
That's
actually,
right.
so it's a much larger
That's right.
benefit.
It's just not an eligibility requirement.
And a safe community is, by and large, one of the highest priorities for the community. And regardless of the amount of housing that we have, no matter what type, if the community is not safe, then it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference now, does it?
Then you wouldn't have a successful project area.
No, you wouldn't have a project area, and you wouldn't have a very successful city either. So it seems to me that we need to think about being not penny wise and pound foolish here. So if there is money to be had, now Mission Creek is a project that overarches a lot of jurisdictions, and so there's a lot of money to be had, some of which needs to be ours. But as far as the village, I thought we should have done the $1 million for the fix-it, the plaza, 3 years ago. So I'm not a fan of that at any rate. So I won't be particularly enamored with that plan at all. And the village, we don't even know what that's going to look like. So these are speculative projects, and I think that the conditions of that building, since we're not going to, as a community, build a new police building, we need to think long and hard about how this isn't just lockers with plugs in them. This is a whole air and maintenance, air conditioning, not cold, but it's heat as well. It's a whole air system throughout the entire building. It's electrical for a very important part of the building that not only houses our police folks, but it also is part of the jail. It's part of the records keeping. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on in the basement and part of the second floor there that really make it what the functioning part of how our department operates, and to not have that up to speed and we should have funded this years ago, and it would have cost half as much as it does. So I just don't think there's any excuse whatsoever to not going forward with the whole project. And so I don't really want to go into the general fund. I've said that before. I think RDA can and should absorb it, as it is the fire department retrofit, which is in the project, but it's also doing capital. It's doing retrofitting of a building for the fire department. I don't see a difference here. I never have. So that's my point of view.
Okay, Schneider, you have a comment?
Sure. Well, to me, it's a no-brainer to use RDA funds for what was mentioned already, and to use general fund reserves. I think we need to be prudent on the operations of the city, and this is a capital project that assists the whole city, but also the project area. And so then the question for me is which option. I would say at the very minimum option B, just because of the backup diesel generator and the safety aspect behind that. One thing that intrigues me about option C is the $30,000 a year savings in energy costs. That's a general fund expense that, as time goes by, year after year, will become then a general fund savings. And who knows where energy cost is going to go over time. And I didn't see that kind of whole life cost analysis that I know in our sustainability committee and up on council, we've talked about that with other projects, about what would be the full cost savings over the life of the project. in terms of reduced cost and energy and other things over time. So there's a big difference between the 1.8 and the 5.2, and I want to recognize that. I tend to agree, like we did with the Korea Rec Center, that if we're going to do it, let's do it right. But I want to see, I feel like I don't have quite enough information to make that, to go up to the 5.2 given all the other pieces. To me, the list that you gave, Mr. Bossi, of the different projects, the Lower Mission Creek one is the most important one, because for me would be, if we're going to get state or federal funds for that kind of thing, we might have to show a local match, and that's where, in order to get any state or federal funding. So we need to have some funds available for that, and RDA is the appropriate place for that if we can't get it from county flood control or other areas. So I feel like I'm not getting the full picture yet to go between B and C, but I'm definitely at least at B, because to me, for 200 whatever thousand between the two differences, to have the backup generator seems like a no-brainer as well. But and also it's a no-brainer to use RDA funds.
Okay, now you get to hear from me. I'm not interested in using general fund reserves for this project. I think it's fine for the RDA to support this, perfectly justifiable. I'm not clear whether Mr. Armstrong has to agree to approve it or not. He's sitting back here, but I think it is specifically out of the area, although it's related to the area. So some sort of approval. Is that, Jim, is that going to be council or is that city administrator?
The council at some point will have to make findings, but that would, we can come up with the appropriate findings. We don't think that's going to be a problem.
Okay, great. I didn't think so. Now, as to the options, I also have a little bit of a confusion. First of all, I'm perfectly fine with option C. I've been touring that building since, when were we elected? 2002, 2001. And it hasn't gotten any better over the years. So I definitely think we need to do work on it. Now, what I'm not clear about is this isn't the only thing that needs work in that building. And I favor option C, but I want to know how that would relate to other needs of that building. In other words, I don't like to do a piecemeal project. I know that we're just addressing the locker room today, and I think it's pretty clear that we all agree that the RDA is fine, and then there's some question about option B or option C. I'm clear that I want to go with C, but I want to go with C with full knowledge. I don't want to go with C. For example, Ms. Schneider just raised a question of the women's locker room not having the sort of electrical that we'd wind up in the men's. I'd like to have an idea of what that would do. There may be other areas in the building that we haven't even talked about today that I just want to know how it ties together before I feel comfortable in making a recommendation. My final point, though, is one of timing. We have a infrastructure task force report coming up here in the next few weeks. I'm really interested in knowing what that report says. There may be some funding options for projects such as this that we haven't even talked about here today. There would be some other options, even though to reiterate, I still am fine with the RDA, but there may be some other ways to fund it if we were to expand the project to include a remodel of the building. Further, I'm very much aware of what Ms. Falcone has been bringing back to us from her visits with California League of Cities and the potential impact of an ERAF shift. And I'm reluctant to recommend that council spends $5.2 million at this time until we have a little bit clearer picture later in the fall, perhaps, about what that's going to look like. If the state of California comes after the RDA, I'd like to know the extent that might be, because that could impact not only this project, but the other ones that were listed here by Mr. Bossi. So I'm not quite ready to go ahead with this. I want it done, and I want the full project done, but exactly when do we release the work orders is an issue for me. And then to sum up, I want to know how this relates to the other needs of that building. So that's where I'm at on it.
Chairman, committee members, maybe I could offer a suggestion. Maybe we could, at this point, get the direction to go ahead with the rest of the design and finish the design of the entire system, including the HVAC system for the entire building. And in the meantime, we can get you some information on a building assessment report or building condition report. It won't be a detailed report, but it may be something that we could touch on and see. And I don't know the timing of the task force and when their report's out, but I imagine we should finish the design probably in November of this year. So that would give us enough time.
When you say finish the design, does that mean you would look at the other needs of that building? Is that
No, we would finish the design of this these current projects.
You're not addressing my question then.
Right, and then at the same time have a parallel track and move ahead with those different elements.
I see there's a PD rep here. Does the building, is this the only thing the building needs, or am I correct in assuming it needs more than this?
Grief, no.
Chief Glaus is here.
It needs a new building, but we're not getting one.
Deputy Chief Glaus.
Thanks. Chairman Horton, members of council, there's a number of ways we can, I can try to answer that question. I can tell you first off that we've done a number of incremental projects over the years that have had a tremendous positive impact on our way of doing business and the building and not just for our employees but also for our customers. The last one that we did, as you all know, a few years ago was the major remodel of the lobby, in addition of restrooms for the public in the main lobby, and that turned out well. A few years before that, we did a pretty comprehensive rebuild of the communications center, which has worked out well and is still quite functional and working as delivered. Also, Public Works periodically would do smaller remodel projects for us, which have enhanced the building. Two of which was the briefing room in the EOC area, which had an extensive remodel, and also our coffee room, our lunchroom upstairs. All of those were major improvements. That being said, we've had a lot of discussions in an imperfect world of what are the different options we might have in having a more modern and complete police facility. And certainly at the site location that we're at, there's no easy answers for that. There's a number of questions that come up in terms of space. Over the years, we've had a lot of discussion. We've had engineers and designers up on the roof to talk about, would it be in our best interest to do a roof build out to have more square footage and change the configuration of the building in a larger sense. We lease a lot of property in the back, which actually serves us well, both in terms of office space and parking, which we need, and it allowed us to open up more parking for the public and improve the convenience to the public there. However, that's an annual expense that's going to continue to go up in terms of the lease. So when we talk about what we would do with the building and in terms of serving our needs, all those options are always out there, and I don't think we've really come to terms with, I think we do realize that the total replacement of the building, which would probably be preferred, is just cost prohibitive, and the actual building as it is right now, for all intents and purposes, functions relatively well. So I think it's just a matter of the scope of a project to bring it up to a certain standard that I suppose we would have to figure out exactly what we want that standard to be, given the resources available. And I'm not sure that picture is completely clear.
The full project cost here of 5.2 is a pretty significant amount of money, of capital funds. And I'm reluctant, although I think it's entirely 100% needed, I'd hate to think that we overlooked for example, as Ms. Schneider just mentioned, some wiring in the women's locker room because we just didn't expand our vision out far enough. So I would like for somebody to take a quick peek at the rest of it and see if there's anything else that should be included in this. If not, then that's fine too. But it just seems like if we're going to spend this much money, we ought to look at the entire picture and not just part of it. That's where I'm coming from. As far as proceeding with the plans and the estimating, we'll have to ask the committee what they think about that.
Mr. Chair.
Please.
Thank you. You know, in a perfect world, the bond that was floated in 1995 or 9 or whenever that was, a long time ago, would have passed, but for a whole variety of factors it didn't. And so we are not going to get a new building, and we have to come to grips with the fact that this is the building, this is the property for all intents and purposes. We do lease the annex, we do lease some other things, but we've been doing incremental fixes to this 1950s bunker, which literally is a bunker. It was built to, what was it, civil defense specs. It is concrete, and if there's ever anything that we are a target for, head for that building, because that's the safest place within a 100-mile radius. But the fact is that it has been also in a deteriorating state since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and here we are. So taking a tour and looking at the deteriorating floors and the leaking pipes and the conduits that are overhead that are seeping and just the conditions of the locker room by themselves is bad enough. But this amount of money takes into account the entire air system for a 1950s bunker. So it's not just, that's not a piecemeal, that would be a full fix. The electronics and the basement, it would be a large portion of the fix for the basement, with the exception of the range and the holding cells, maybe. Right? Okay. So it sounds to me like they're sort of going, you know, floor by floor in sort of incremental ways in some fashion or another, although the comm room's also in the basement, the Murphy room, which is we use it as the EOC during the Zaka fire. That's where all of our emergency folks went. So it is an incremental fix, but that's kind of the world we're living in with respect to this building. So I would love to see this project go forward in its entirety, at least through design. And if we can come back with the final yay or nay in something like November, because I haven't heard of any ERAF shifts, although that's always possible. It looks more like a property tax yank, so I'm not from the state. But nevertheless, it's still, you know, an unknown out there, and I think we need, as Mr. Horton said, to be very cognizant of it. I've been warning of it, and I really do think we need to do that. But this is an untenable condition that we need to not delay any further. We've been delaying for years and years and years, and here is something that's really important. It's a majority of the electrical system. It's the entire air movement system, and it is, you know, a bunch of the basement that a lot of people who serve our community spend a lot of time in. You know, the locker room, changing, coming and going, and this and that, and showers and working out. We want them to be healthy. So I'd like to at least make a motion to go through with design. I'd like to make a motion to be able to go forward in its entirety, but I'd like a motion that's going to carry. So I will see what we can do here. I would at least like to make a motion to go forward with the design work for the 5.2.
Do you want to suggest that we use the RDA?
Out of the RDA money,
Okay.
absolutely.
Is there a second to that? Yeah. Okay. We have a motion and a second. Mr. Pearson, you have that written down. All those in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Yes, please.
if you're going to go through the design and come back to council, given that we're looking at the option C, the full cost analysis of it and the savings with energy and so forth, which I would like to see those numbers, because I think that will help the rest of the council as well see the benefit of over time those savings and cost. And I guess another piece of information would be, I'm assuming if we didn't do the HVAC system now, we're going to have to do it at some point.
Yeah.
And, you know, the RDA is only going to last so long. So if the RDA is our source of funding, and after a certain point in time it's only used for debt service, we might no longer have that source of funding to use for this kind of project. So in some ways, time's almost even running out for, I mean, if we're going to upgrade the HVAC system anyway, why not do it now? And, you know, so those pieces of information I think would be helpful when this goes to full council. But I agree, I think we need to see what the state does, whether it's a property tax yank or, you know, or just a take from the RDA funds. That could happen too, like it has before. Thank you.
Okay. Any further comments from the committee? Yes, Mr. Armstrong.
A couple things. One, I'm going to ask the engineering folks as a part of this to, when they do the design, to make sure that if we have some kind of critical path on future improvements to the building, we know about it. So what we don't want to do is spend a lot of money and then find out that if we do something else 4 years down the road that we have to, you know.
It's the old
something.
tear up the street and then tear it up again.
Exactly. And then I think we will also, I'll ask them to look at the cost of the women's locker room to at least power it, because I think we get ourselves and have some unhappy female employees if.
That would be great if we could do both with this kind of
We'll
money.
look at those costs. And then what we'll do is take this to council for approval to go forward with the final design and mention all of this in the staff report.
Perfect. Okay. Any further comments from anyone? If not, meeting adjourned.